So welcome back to part 2 of my 3D printing guide for noobs. Please watch part 1 if you haven't watched it already, but I want to dedicate part 2 to some tips and tricks I use to support my models. Again, I think supporting a model is very important, and if you do a good job, it's much easier down the road when you're preparing the model for painting. There are some important things I think we have to bear in mind when we talk about supporting is that it's actually very hard to print large models, models that are scaled up compared to smaller models. A small increase in the print area results in a very high increase in suction force with the FEP film. I think the relationship is like it's a square of how much the area is increased by, so it's not proportional. Again, a small increase in area, big increase in suction force, and the way we sort of help mitigate this is we hollow the model to make the print area smaller. To counteract this increase in suction force, we can add more supports, which promotes print stability, but at the same time we acknowledge that the more supports there are, the more scarring there will be. And we acknowledge that where there are supports, there will be scarring. There's simply no such thing as supporting a model and there being no scars. It's part of it. So I guess we have to think about what strategies we can use to reduce the support scarring, and what can we do about that? The consequence to not having enough supports is print failure, delamination, Z-lines, and general print instability. So my solution has been to use adequate supports with increased exposure times to strengthen both the strength of the supports and the 3D print generally. The drawback to increasing exposure time is an arguable potential detail loss in the model. Though, as we know, this depends on how you define details. The truth is, when you increase exposure time, some details will become better, while other details will become worse. Next, I will sort of take you through how I go about supporting a model to make it easier to prepare the item to paint. So here is in part 1 I showcase my 2B model. This is a part of the 2B model. This is the right? Yeah, it's the right thigh. You can see that this part here is going to be attached to the hip, and this is going to be attached to the lower leg. So even before we think about adding any supports, we have to hollow the model first. You can see that currently it's very solid. And as the model prints upwards, I mean, this is a lot of area that's going to be attached to the FEP sheet down here. And that's very risky. So this is what I do. I hollow the model with a wall thickness of 1.2 millimeters. Just based on looking around, I think 1.2 millimeters in comparison to what other people do seems to be on the smaller end of wall thicknesses that you see. But I think that 1.2 millimeter wall thickness is good enough. For precision, I put 0%. I don't need it to be precise. I do have an infill structure of infill density 10%. Why 10%? 10% seems like a nice number, but regardless, the effect of this is that you have a somewhat hollow model with this sort of mesh-like structure inside, which lends to the stability and strength of the model. Okay, so it's a way of having such small wall thicknesses while still having the model be quite strong, and this will make it less susceptible to warping and general sort of Z-line defects, that sort of thing. That's what I found. Okay, next we have to consider where we add the holes. This is not terrifically important, but I like to add holes generally in these sorts of spots. You know, I try to avoid holes in sort of attachment points, like here, where like this is meant to interface with the hip, and in order to get a really clean interface attachment between different areas, like a good joint, you want it to be as clean as possible. And adding holes sometimes like causes it to warp. It's a small deal. Sometimes you find you have to add the hole somewhere, and this is the best spot, in which case you would. But if I can get away with this, I'll do this. And then before we start adding supports to it, we have to think about how we want to orientate this model. So bearing in mind, just before I said that wherever you add supports, there will be scars, right? So I have to decide, well, we have to decide where we want the scarring to be. And for this one, when I printed the 2B model, I decided I prefer the scarring to be here rather than here, because here it's very apparent if the joint between the hip is bad, but here, you know, you can sand it a bit, you know, it's facing towards the ground. It's just a better arrangement. So that's what I decided to do. And you can see by default the thigh here is already somewhat tilted, which is good. So as it prints up, it's gradually printing the thigh at an angle here, which is good. You don't want to print it all at once. Just gradually, good. All right. And then now the next thing is what kind of supports do you want to use? Now I do have light, medium, and heavy presets which I've tweaked, but I will say I do mainly use the heavy preset, and I don't think I've tweaked that much at all from default. I don't think it's really that important either. I only care about the top part anyway. So here's the trick with supporting that I think here's a trick with supporting that I think a lot of people don't know. So this is the basic support, okay? So you got contact shape of none. Okay, this support right here. This is the basic one that most people use, and it's serviceable, but it's going to leave scarring, and all supports will leave scarring, but it will leave a sort of scar that is like this. So imagine this is like a flat surface, right? So this is this flat surface. If you have a support like this with the tip like this, and you remove that tip after you after you've printed the model and you're removing the supports, you remove that tip, it's going to create a scar like this. So this is where the tip was, and just local proximal to it, you're going to have a small bump on either side. It's just how it is. And you can sand it down here, and you can sand these sort of bumps away, but the depression will still be present. And in order for you to sand it so that it's completely flat, like how it's supposed to be up here, you would have to completely alter, you know, like the geometry of the 3D print here. It's not feasible because the depression is just so large. So that's what you get when you do this. But for this sort of shape, this area, this joint, having that sort of scarring pattern is not going to be a big deal, because you're going to attach, you know, the lower leg to this part. It's going to be covered up. It doesn't matter if there are small depressions here. If you sand these bumps out, it's going to be, you know, you're going to have a flat surface to glue the lower leg to. So that's all right. So for this, you know, I might just sprinkle these heavy supports along here and call it a day. I don't care. There's going to be a small bump. I'll sand it off. The depression that's left behind when you remove the tip here, you know, that's fine. I'm not going to see it. No one's going to be able to see it. But what if we're talking about supporting places like here? You know, you might have to put some supports here. And you see that when you remove the tip here, you're going to get a depression around this rim of the outer thigh. And this part is going to be apparent to people, you know, when you're looking at the model, this depression is going to be apparent. You can't hide it because it's outwards facing. you're not fixing a joint onto this area. So what's the solution there? So I discovered that in Chi2 Box you can actually use a sphere contact shape. So the effect of that is, there's a sphere at the end of it. The good thing about the sphere is that when you remove it after you've printed the model, you're removing the supports, it will break off at this area. Just before the tip turns into the sphere, that's where it will break off. So that's the third picture here. When you remove the support, you will have, instead of a depression, you'll have a bump. Okay. Now you can sand this bump down, and you'll get a perfect flat surface. So you can imagine, you're putting these sort of sphere supports alongside the outer rim here. You snap it off just before it turns into the sphere. Get some sandpaper and just sand it down. That way you have like a smooth skin surface without any depression. And that's really the trick to, minimizing the effects of scarring on the quality of your 3D prints. There are some situations you find where you're forced to create supports on visible skin areas. For example, like this. You might find that you're unable to use this part. You're unable to use this part. For some reason, you have to put supports there. In this case, you have to rely on your sphere supports, right? If you use the tips, you create these depressions in the model. It'll be very ugly. You won't be able to sand them out. But if you create sphere supports, yes, after you remove the supports, you get small bumps. But you just take some sandpaper to it. Let's say 320 grit sandpaper. Do it once, a few times, and then get some 600 grit sandpaper. Do it again. You get a very smooth surface, and after you prime it and everything, you really won't notice that supports were there at all. So that's the trick to supporting these sorts of models. I'm not going to talk about other sort of basics of supporting. If you want to learn more about supports, there are other YouTube channels you could watch, but I think this is like a very important tip and trick that I want to share with you today.